Well, hope everybody's doing good. Thanks for joining us again. Hope everybody's staying healthy and safe, uh, and you're surviving during this time of social distancing. Uh, I've really come to the conclusion that God's people are meant to be together. While it's not good that man should be alone by himself without a companion, it's not good that brethren be alone without one another. And so I look forward to the time we can be together face to face again. We're going to turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 7 today. And we're going to break this chapter up into three separate studies. There's just a lot here to think about. When we come to this chapter, we're making a shift in the book. The first six chapters have to do with things that have been reported to Paul by the house of Chloe. Now we come to chapter 7 and going forward, and Paul is going to be addressing some things that he has received in the matter of questions that he has received. We don't have the questions. It would have been nice if we had had the questions, especially for me, at least in chapter 7. We're only left to surmise or suppose what those questions might have been. But nonetheless, let's begin our study in chapter 7. In chapter 7, Paul begins in verse 1 and says, "Now concerning the things of which you wrote to me, it's good for man not to touch a woman." It's good for man not. Is Paul contradicting what Moses says in Galatians chapter 2? It's not good that man should be alone. No, Paul's not doing that. In fact, you have to look at what is under consideration here. You look at verse 26, and Paul will say, "I suppose, therefore, that it is good because of the present distress, it's good for a man to remain as he is." So whatever's taking place here in Corinth, Paul is saying in this time, in this situation, it would be good for a man not to be married. And he uses this by saying it's good for a man not to touch a woman. The word touch is used euphemistically here. It refers to the marriage and the conjugal relationship between a husband and wife in the marriage relationship. Well, why the word touch? Well, evidently there's some relationship between touch and the act. Actually, what you have here in this word touch is a figure of speech of a part put for the whole. Touch is put for the whole of the intimate relationship sexually between a husband and a wife. So observation tells us something that those of us who are married have already learned. One of the dangers of dating is because many haven't learned the power of a touch. Yet the Bible uses the word because of what it leads to. It uses the word because of its relationship to what it leads to. So it's an important observation not only in the Bible, but in human experiences, to learn the dangers of that. And so here it applies in this situation in Corinth. And he's saying, this is why this is taking place in these certain circumstances. Look at verse 36 on top of verse 26, and he'll also say, "And this I say to your own profit, not that I put a leash on you for what is proper, but that you may serve the Lord without distraction." When a man has a wife, as in this certain circumstance, he says there's just another distraction. Not wrong to have a wife, but he said it'd be better to remain as you are, because when you add that relationship of a wife, then you're concerned about the things of your wife. That's proper. That's what it ought to be. It requires your wife, your husband requires your full attention. But it would be better that you not be distracted by that full attention that you may give yourself completely to the Lord in this set of circumstances. And so while Paul refers to this undistracted attention to the Lord over marriage, and that's what his appeal is, he realizes that may not work for some, that many people need partners to go with whom to go through life. Not everyone is gifted to go it alone. And so he will say in verse 2, "Nevertheless, because of sexual immorality, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband." So he's not just talking about any kind but sexual immorality, fornication, unlawful sexual intercourse, the King James says. I think this tells us something at the very outset that's really, really important for us to get. If there's a danger to fornication on premarital sex, this is what he says. Because of the danger of that each man have his own wife. That tells you something about the strength of the desire. And I think that's something that we also need to acknowledge. I think we do our young people a disservice when we tell them, you can't have that desire until you're married. But here Paul says, you have that desire before you're married. We tell them you shouldn't have that desire. That's not so. The desire itself is not sinful. In fact, he says, because of the dangers associated with it, you ought to get married. The New American Standard says, because of evil passions, strong and governable passions. One might think, well, this is the only sin in committing fornication. No, there's a sin back of it. It's the passion. It's the strong passion to commit that. So while we say in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 2, those strong desires are there before marriage and can be holy, H-O-L-Y, we must be aware of the fact there's a barrier God has put there as well. We must govern our passions and emotions, and God is concerned not only with what we do, but what we think, and want to do. And so while this is an important part of the marriage relationship, we must also recognize that marriage is a life-sharing relationship and involves not just the sexual aspect, but the sharing of life socially, mentally, and spiritually. And to focus on one is a limited view of marriage. Hold your finger there in 1 Corinthians and turn to Colossians chapter 3 real quickly. Colossians chapter 3 and verse 5. He says, therefore put to death your members which are on the earth, fornication, uncleanness, passion, evil desire, and covetousness, which is idolatry. So here he's warning about the heart of man. So here he deals not only with the act of premarital sex or sexual immorality, sex outside of marriage, but the passion within that is associated with it. So he deals with the idea of passion, evil desire, uncleanness, impurity, deeds that would lead to that, contribute and associated with fornication. That would lead to all kinds of considerations. It would lead to X-rated movies. It would lead to pornography. Anything of which would be filthy or mimic the sexual relationship between a husband and a wife. But Paul's point here, and it's well taken, is that strong desire is there before marriage, and we ought to acknowledge that and teach our young people that it is okay to have that strong desire, but that God has placed boundaries around that strong desire, not only for the act itself, but for our thinking and what we want to do. So we return to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, and we come to verse 3. Some of the Christians in Corinth didn't forbid marriage, but they did prohibit sexual intercourse between the husband and a wife. And so he says, let the husband render to his wife affection due her, and likewise also the wife due affection. So the husband has a responsibility, a duty to fulfill, and the wife has a responsibility, a duty to fulfill. This idea of due affection is the idea of duty or responsibility. And so what he says is the fulfillment of this responsibility of a husband toward his wife and a wife toward her husband is a duty. It is a duty. It's not all about bells sounding and trains blowing horns. It's not about some euphoric experience all the time. There is a duty that is involved here. There's something owed, is what he's saying. There is something owed. The husband owes something to his wife. The wife owes something to her husband. That word duty is the same word we use for paying our bills. I don't know that anybody sits down at the first of the month, the first of the week to pay their bills and said, this is just going to be such an erotic experience for me. I cannot wait to pay these bills. I can't wait to push Zelle. I can't wait to push this bill pay. I can't wait to push checks, to write a check. No, there's something to do. Why do you do it? You do it because there's an obligation there. So the Holy Spirit speaks of this relationship as something owed, something due. Our society puts a totally different picture on that. Our society says, well, if there's no passion stirred, then there's no obligation. So Paul says here, even if there is no passion stirred, there's an obligation. Then he says, do benevolence. That's the King James. The New King James says, do affection. And I think what he's talking about there is human nature gives obligation its fulfillment because of goodwill. That's the meaning. Goodwill is the meaning of the term affection or benevolence. This obligation is paid out of goodwill. This responsibility is fulfilled out of goodwill. The kind of thing that should govern our attitudes in these matters is goodwill. The husband owes something to his wife because of goodwill. The wife owes something to her husband because of goodwill. Goodwill governs this relationship. So in verse 3 he says, let the husband fulfill his duty to his wife, and the wife fulfill her husband to her husband. So we have this obligation that takes place. I think there's something else that happens in this. And what that says is that both husband and wife have this desire. It's not just one or the other. He says the wife has the desire, the husband has the desire. Now, that doesn't mean the desires are equally as strong, but what he's saying is both have this desire. The wife has sexual desires, the husband has sexual desires. And those desires fulfilled in the marriage relationship are not impure, they're not unclean. And we need to understand, we must understand that we have that obligation one toward the other. So here he says, don't sever yourself from your wife no longer than when she can fulfill your desires in the marital realm, and you put her in a position that she'll fulfill those desires, and it'll be an unlawful relationship. You stay with her. You stay with her. You stay with her and fulfill those desires. What happens when a man and a woman even may stay together but withhold themselves from one another, or they separate where these desires cannot be satisfied? Then one goes to another and has those desires satisfied. Oh, you committed fornication. Yes, but did I contribute to that by refusing to fulfill my obligation to my mate? We talk about the word unfaithful in the marriage relationship. And most time when we say, well, he or she has been unfaithful, what they mean is they've taken and shared that sexual intimacy with someone, not their husband or their wife, someone outside of the marriage relationship. I would suggest to think about this. When a husband or a wife withhold themselves from their mate and refuse to fulfill the obligation that is there, is that being faithful? Is that being faithful? Doesn't unfaithful equally apply to when one refuses to fulfill the need of the other? I'm not suggesting that unfaithfulness in that way is equivalent to unfaithfulness when one steps outside the marriage relationship and by then can have the right to put one away and have the right to be remarried. I'm not suggesting unfaithfulness that grows out of a refusal to render out of goodwill the need to satisfy their mate is also a right to put away and have the right to be remarried. I'm suggesting that unfaithful is much broader than just simply the fact someone stepped outside of the marriage relationship. to fulfill their sexual desires. Again, this is a desire both husband and wife have. And so to fulfill that desires, to prevent burning in your own lust, he says that each one have his own wife, each wife have her own husband. And out of goodwill, you satisfy the need of the other. Not because it's simply passions raging, but because there is a need to be fulfilled. In fact, the Bible speaks rather graphically about this relationship, this intimate relationship between a husband and a wife. I would reference you to Proverbs chapter 5, verses 15 and following. I would ask you to read the Song of Solomon. The Song of Solomon gets very graphic with regard to what this relationship is and how the ecstasy of this relationship can be enjoyed. And so, the sexual relationship is essential in marriage. And we need to ensure that our mate's needs are being met. And so he will say in verse 4, the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise, the husband does not have authority of his own body, but the wife does. Obviously, one has the power to withhold themselves. But when he says does not have the authority, doesn't have the right. The husband does not have the right over his own body. The wife doesn't have the right over her own body. Sexual gratification should not be withheld. It is a right owed to the other. And so, he says here the husband doesn't have a right to withhold. His body, when he marries, belongs to her. Her body, when she marries, belongs to him. Your body no longer belongs to you. You are giving your body to the other. You're giving your body to the fulfillment of those sexual desires to your mate. Now again, that doesn't suggest that the desires are as strong, equally shared. But what it suggests is the goodwill through which this need is supplied is equally as strong. The goodwill through which this need is met as a sense of duty is equally strong. And so we owe this duty toward one another out of goodwill. Then Paul will say in verse 5, do not deprive one another except with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and come together again so that Satan does not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Here is abstinence by mutual consent. Paul says, here is a time in which you have devoted yourself to prayer. And only when the reason is serious enough to drive you to your needs in prayer. You have abstinence for a brief period of time. It is temporary and it is agreed upon. It's temporary so that you'll not be tempted to meet the physical need outside of the marriage relationship. So he says, do not defraud. That word defraud is the same word as cheat. Don't cheat one another. Don't deprive. Stop defrauding. Stop depriving one another. People go to jail because of fraud. How many times do financial advisors, Bernie Madoff, because of fraud, in prison? And we could repeat it on down the line. When we refuse to pay something owed, we cheat the one we owe. That's called fraud. We don't withhold the payment. We give the payment to what is owed. And so he says, you owe something, stop depriving, stop cheating one another. Defraud suggests depriving one of his rights, and usually connotes, according to Webster, the deliberate perversion of the truth. That's why we mention the excuses that are used to deprive a mate of conjugal relationship in marriage. You don't do that without God knowing. Beware of defrauding. Beware of depriving the right that your mate has to your body. Fraud is an act or series of acts of subtle deceit or duplicity by which one carries to benefit himself at another's expense. American College Dictionary. Some use their bodies as bargaining power, pressing their goals by means of pouting or of anger to get what they want, sometimes for punishment. God says that's fraud. Stop depriving, stop defrauding one another. And so I think there's a point worth making here. It may be that men and women, though it seems to me to be hardly unimaginable, may be unaware of the undermining effect this can have on a relationship and one's moral steadfastness. But notice the text says Satan isn't. He knows the strong desires within your mate, and he'll utilize those ends and purposes for his own good. So the text says, only for a time, lest, he says, in the latter part of verse 5, Satan tempt you because of your lack of self-control. There must be serious attention given to this importance in the husband-wife relationship. Failing to receive the proper, intimate love attention, men and women may engage in flirtatious conduct and become vulnerable to that flirtatious conduct. Craving attention, the mate finds it elsewhere. Someone else compliments the wife or the husband on their looks. And because they're not receiving the needed attention at home, they may never have intended to go where it leads, but it leads in the wrong direction. And so we are foolish enough to sometimes think this would never happen to my mate. No one would ever be interested in my mate. Well, you were. How foolish. Somebody out there is going to be lonely and would like to have your mate. Satan would love to use a poor relationship in marriage and break down your home, your morals, and rob you of your spiritual heritage. He is the tempter. He is the solicitor, and he wants to seduce. So God is telling us how to build a barrier against that by having a healthy, satisfying relationship between the husband and a wife. Don't be apart too long, lest Satan tempt you. And many times men and women are. And we excuse it on the basis of civil responsibilities, job, and social obligations. God said, don't do that. A discontinuance of the conjugal relationship is allowed for two things. Number one, by agreement. And number two, for a season. It's not a permanent thing. So that a lack of self-control will not be used by Satan as a powerful tool to seduce your mate. How many people think when they get married they want to be untrue to their mates? I've never asked this question in a marriage ceremony. I've never stood before a young couple or older couple getting married and say, do you promise to keep yourself to your mate only as long as you both shall live? And do you ever plan to be unfaithful? Do you plan to be unfaithful? What would happen if someone said yes? What would that do to us? But it happens. It happens all the time. So this is a warning to the married and the unmarried. Don't put yourself in a place to be tempted. The sexual desire, like hunger, is a strong natural impulse, and satisfied properly within the proper boundaries is wholesome when controlled. But Satan would love to see our power of self-restraint severely tested and have it fail. Don't allow yourself or your mate to get into such circumstances. Satan is looking for that limit of your self-control, and there's no more powerful stimulus than the sexual drive of a man and a woman. Look, our advertisers understand that. People with cologne, advertising cologne and perfume understand that. People with toothpaste understand that. Something else. This was written to Christians, not the ungodly. Don't put self or allow yourself to be put in a compromising situation. How many young people, never intending to violate their purity, have done so because they go beyond the point of control? They didn't intend to, but it reached the point where they didn't turn back. How many men and women married, never intended to, but whatever led to it got beyond their control because they lost control of their desires. So Paul will emphasize this later. Paul has already emphasized this, as we've seen in 1 Corinthians chapter 6. Flee fornication. That is, flee as a fugitive flees from the law. Don't flirt with temptation. Go to people. Don't flirt with the temptation. Go to places where where temptation is before them. Let me say that again. Don't flirt with the temptation by going to places with people where temptation is before them. And parents, we need to be on guard about allowing our children to be in circumstances in our own homes by themselves, late hours, early mornings where there's no supervision. Good kids, yes, but we're dealing with one of the most powerful drives in the world, the sexual drive. Flee fornication. Run from it. And then verse 7, then we'll close. Verses 6 and 7, but I say this as a concession, not as a commandment. Paul said, I'm giving you the wisest advice I can give you, but this is the advice of an inspired man. Verse 7, for I wish that all men were even as I myself, but each has his own gift from God, one in this matter and another in that. It's better to remain single than marry, choosing someone who will not help you go to heaven, who will create relational problems far greater than it solves. To marry someone who will hinder our growth as Christians is going to create more problems than remaining single. It's better to stay single than to try to grow with a partner who think they've learned all the spiritual skills they need and therefore are not going to grow. To marry for the wrong motive, marrying for money, for power, for prestige, even for sex, is going to lead to disaster. To marry without being willing to give ourselves to another completely is going to lead to disaster. All of us struggle with selfishness to some degree. But if we're unwilling to sacrifice our own wants and needs for those of another every day for the rest of our lives, we should entertain marriage. But it's better to marry if our lives would be more complete with a mate. Marriage will live with us with new motivation and joy. It's better to marry if God leads us to someone we love and who loves us. It's better to marry if we're confident that our relationship will illustrate Christ's love for the church. We don't really love enough to marry if our love is not sacrificial like Christ. If we're willing to love, if we're willing to give deeply of ourselves, we're ready to join lives with a partner. It's better to marry if we are willing to spend the remainder of our days giving more than receiving. Living successfully with a partner takes a lot of time and practice. Only if we are ready to consistently put this kind of effort should we seriously think about marrying. Powerful information that Paul gives to the first part of chapter 7. Well, thanks for thinking about this with me. And we'll pick up again in verse 8 in our next study. Have a good day and stay healthy.